Uh, Pooja R asked me a question. What is the yield curve and what does it mean when it's inverted? Thanks, Pooja, for asking a question like this. It's better than asking, is this a good fund or is that a bad fund? I find these questions easier to handle. So, what is a yield curve? A yield curve is a plot of the price that you pay for money over different periods of time. So if HDFC Limited were to borrow money in the market and it borrowed money for say 10 years, 9 years, 8 years, 7 years, suppose it borrows for 10 years every year. So over a 10-year period, they will have a yield curve. That would be the HDFC Limited yield curve. It would plot the 1-year interest, 2-year interest, 3-year interest, and logically it will go up because the longer that the money is tied up, the higher the rate of interest that you will pay or you will receive also. So your savings bank account pays the least interest, your 30-day deposit pays more, your 365-day deposit pays even better, 5-year deposit pays even better, and if you are willing to lock it in for 15 years, PPF pays you best, right? Because banks have to get money, banks have to know what they can do with that money for a long period of time, saying, okay, if this person is putting money away for 15 years, there's a good chance that, I mean, of course, he could come and redeem it after 6 years saying, I want to take away half, but the chances are 90% of the funds or 80% of the funds will stay with me for 15 years, so I can take a long-term view when I invest. So bankers always pay more to the person keeping money for a longer period. The longer you are willing to lock in your money, the higher the interest rates you will pay. That is exactly what a yield curve shows you. Now, if many companies were to borrow for various periods of time, you could have each company's yield curve. So you could have Tata Steel yield curve, you could have HDFC yield curve, Larsen and Toubro yield curve, right? Banks are very unlikely to come and borrow like this because they have their own CASA. But for manufacturing companies, if the RBI had forced people, this is how the debt market would have developed. You would know what is L&T yield curve and what is the Tata Steel yield curve. Today we are using one yield curve called the GSEC, which is the Government of India yield curve, because various borrowings are there for various periods of time. So it is easy to construct a yield curve for the Government of India bonds, municipal bonds, etc. People who are almost perennially borrowing and repaying through taxes or by general inflation. So that is what an yield curve does. So Pooja, your second question is what does it mean when it is inverted? Like I said, the longer you put the money, the higher is the yield. So that is what a normal yield curve shows. It shows it going up. Now, can you apply the same thing to bonds? Yes, it should be possible to apply the same thing to bonds. Largely, when you're putting money in a fixed deposit or when you're putting money in a bond, you are lending money to an institution which could be further lending. It could be an NBFC which is giving gold loans, it could be an NBFC which is giving car loans and scooter loans or housing loans. So they are also using money for that. So you need a very efficient market for borrowing, and a market which will punish you if you over borrow and reward you if you are very conservative, right? So what happens in case of exactly like how you get higher rates when you put money for the longer period, that's what normally should happen. However, sometimes what happens is you have something called an inverted yield curve. That is that yield on the 3-month paper could be higher than the yield on the shorter term paper, maybe on a 6-month paper or a 1-year paper, right? Even sometimes even the 20-year or a 10-year treasury bills could be quoting at a price which is very not congruent with what is happening in the shorter end of the curve. So it's not difficult to understand what's happening. What is happening is at the lower end, the RBI controls interest rates, right? You saw that recently. They've dropped repo rates and all that. But at the higher end, even today, there are Indian NBFCs which would be borrowing at 10% plus for a 10-year period. simply because that kind of money is not available from the Reserve Bank, right? So Reserve Bank or the regular banks are not very keen to lend to an NBFC at the upper end of the curve. The 10-year money is not available. So an NBFC would be very happy to borrow money at 10% from you for a 10-year commitment for, say, at least 5 to 10 lakhs. In fact, there is at least one NBFC which is doing it through bonds. Of course, bonds are listed, so bonds have a marketability, but there is no great secondary market for it. That is the inefficiency of this. So at the longer end of the yield curve, it's more difficult to estimate what is happening because there are many factors at play. What will be the interest rate? So if I'm, say, sitting in the US, do I want to invest in India just because the longer yield is attractive? I also have to figure in what will happen to my currency, right? And there may not be enough people who want to put money in debt for a 10-year period, typically taking the view that if it is anyway being put away for 10 years, why can't I be in equity, which is technically more efficient, right? Or which is likely to give me a better return. Why should I put into debt instruments? So these are all things which impact the price of money at the higher end, which is a 10-year or a 12-year kind of a thing. So inflation expectations go down, so which means your short-term interest rates could go down. If people think interest rates in India will be at 3% and 4%, their expectation of interest should go down. It may not go down, it normally stays in nominal terms, but yes, these are all reasons you can see why the interest rates are going down at the nearer end and not at the higher end. So this explains a normal curve. Now what happens, what is a